Kansas Territory, May 1871, the wind tore hard across the tallgrass prairie as if it meant to strip away every lie ever told. And still, she rode head down, hands tight on the reins, the hem of her skirt ripped and dust caked. Zadie Dalton had nothing left but the mare beneath her and the ring she'd flung into the river 2 days back. She had believed in love once. Believed in a man who said he would build her a life, raise her 2 children like his own. But when the money came in from the land deal, he vanished with it and the children. That betrayal had split her in 2. She had found her daughter, Daisy, and her son, Dorian, hidden in a neighbor's barn, half-starved and crying for her. The neighbor had said the man left them there like luggage, said he was running after opportunity. Zadie did not cry when she heard that. She only wrapped her children up, took what little coin she had, and left. She would rather trust the mercy of the open prairie than another man. Now, 3 weeks later, she wandered west, not knowing where she was going just away. The sun was low when she saw the cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney, and there was a corral with 1 tall chestnut quarter horse inside. It was the first sign of life in miles. Her mare stumbled, legs trembling. Zadie hesitated. Then Daisy stirred behind her, wrapped against her back in a sling. Dorian's arms tightened around her waist. "Mama," he whispered. "Water." She guided the horse toward the cabin. The man who stepped onto the porch was tall, lean, and sun-browned. Hair the color of river mud curled at his collar, and his eyes were a pale, unreadable gray. A rifle hung casually in one hand, but he did not raise it. Zadie stopped at the edge of the yard. "We are not looking for trouble. I can see that," he said, voice low but steady. "You look like you are looking for a place to breathe." She nodded once. "The horse needs water, so do the children." He glanced at the little faces pressed to her sides. His gaze softened just a bit. "Come down." "I will get a basin." Zadie slid off the mare stiffly. Her knees nearly gave out when her boots hit the ground. He returned with a dented tin bowl and a dipper. Zadie helped the children drink first, then took a long swallow herself. The water was cold and clean. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, he was watching her, still quiet. "Name's Asa Zachary," he said after a beat. "This place was my father's. He died last winter. I stayed on." Zadie straightened. "Zadie Dalton, these are my children, Dorian and Daisy." He gave a short nod, then looked toward the mare. "She is close to dropping. You ride her far?" "Far enough." "She will not make it much longer." Zadie tightened her jaw. "I know. You can stay the night. There is a spare cot inside." She looked at the cabin, then at the horizon. There was no town for miles, no shelter, no mercy. "Thank you," she said. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine and ash. It was spare but clean. A wood stove stood in the corner, and 2 rifles rested above the mantel. Asa moved with the quiet ease of someone used to being alone. He laid fresh blankets on the cot and set out a tin plate of beans and cornbread. Dorian devoured his food. Daisy curled up beside Zadie, her tiny hand curled in her mother's skirt. Asa sat across the room, near the stove, glancing over now and then but saying little. "How far to the next town?" Zadie asked. 15 miles, maybe more." Zadie's shoulders sagged. "You running from something?" Asa asked, voice low. "No," she said, then paused. "I am running from someone." He nodded once like he understood. That night, Zadie lay on the cot with both children tucked beside her. She stared at the low ceiling, the crackle of fire the only sound. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in weeks, she felt her body begin to rest. The next morning, Asa was already outside when she stepped onto the porch. He was tending to her mare. "You are up early," she said. "She will need rest," he replied, patting the mare's flank. "I can spare a few days' feed." "I do not have much to pay you with," he looked at her then. "I did not ask for payment." Zadie met his gaze. He was not handsome in the usual way. His face was too blunt, his nose crooked from an old break, but there was something steady about him, solid. "I will help where I can," she said. "Cook, clean. Then we are even." It settled like a quiet agreement between them. By the 3rd day, Daisy had started laughing again. Dorian spent the afternoon following Asa around the yard, asking questions about horses and rifles. Asa answered them all, patient and calm. Zadie watched him from the doorway. His sleeves were rolled up, arms corded with work. He had built a life out here alone, and yet he had made space for her and her children without hesitation. That night, after the children slept, she stepped outside. The stars were bright above the prairie, the sky stretched wide and deep. Asa stood by the fence, arms resting on the top rail. She joined him quietly. "I did not think I would ever trust a man again," she said. He looked at her but said nothing. "I believed someone once. He left me worse than he found me." Asa's jaw tightened just a little. "Some men take what they want and leave the wreck behind," she nodded. "That is what he did." "I will not." She turned to him. "Why are you helping me?" He shrugged. "You looked like someone who needed it." Zadie swallowed. "I did." The silence stretched between them, but it was not uncomfortable. Then Asa reached out slowly, deliberately, and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. Her breath caught. "I am not like him," he said softly. She looked up at him, so close now. "I know." The wind shifted. The prairie seemed to hush, and then he kissed her. Gentle, warm, sure. Nothing like the lies she had known before. Just a man offering something real. Zadie leaned into it, her hand resting against his chest. She felt her heart beat there, steady and strong. For the first time in a long time, she did not feel broken. She felt found. The morning after the kiss, Zadie rose before the children stirred, her shawl pulled tight against the chill. The cabin's hearth had burned down to coals, and the air inside was quiet, save for Daisy's soft breathing and the creak of the cot as Dorian rolled over. Outside, the frost still clung to the grass in silver threads. She stepped off the porch, boots crunching lightly, and found Asa mending a broken fence rail with measured strikes of a hammer. He didn't look up right away, just kept working, sleeves damp with dew. She watched his hands calloused, sure, and felt a quiet steadiness settle into her chest. "You start every day with something to fix?" she asked. He rested the hammer against his thigh and turned toward her. "If I don't, the land reminds me something's been left undone." Zadie glanced toward the open fields stretching beyond the fence line. "Seems like it'd take more than one man to keep all this held together." A small breath left his nose. "Most days it does." She folded her arms tighter around herself, fingers tucked under her elbows. "You ever think of leaving it behind?" "I did once," he said. "Went as far as Wichita, took work in a tannery. Thought if I could forget this place, I might forget what got buried here." Zadie leaned against the nearest post, letting the morning sun warm her shoulder. "What brought you back?" He looked past her toward the cabin. "My brother. He didn't want to leave, then the fever came through. Took him in 3 days." She didn't say anything right away. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine smoke. Asa pushed the last nail into the wood with the heel of his hand. After that, this was the only place that still felt real. Zadie stepped closer, her voice low. "Grief makes a home out of the strangest places." He met her eyes. "So does trust." A screen of quiet settled between them, not tense, just full. She stepped back first. "I'll see to breakfast." While she stirred cornmeal over the fire and set strips of salt pork to sizzle, the children woke slowly. Dorian wandered out, rubbing his eyes, hair sticking up in uneven tufts. Daisy padded after him, dragging her blanket across the floor. As she handed them plates, Asa came in, the scent of cured wood and sun on his clothes. He crouched beside Daisy and offered her a carved horse from his pocket, rough-hewn but sturdy. She held it in 2 hands like it might break if she breathed too hard. Zadie watched her daughter's face, soft with wonder. "Did you make that?" He stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "Started it last winter, didn't know who it was for till now." Dorian looked up from his plate. "Can I learn?" Asa nodded. "You got patient hands." Dorian nodded solemnly, his mouth full. "Then we'll start tomorrow." Zadie turned back to the stove, fighting the pull at her throat. Later that afternoon, she found the old garden plot behind the cabin. The soil was hard-packed and littered with last year's stalks, but it hadn't gone wild yet. She knelt with a small spade she'd found in the corner of the shed and began turning the earth. Asa approached, his shadow falling long across the rows. "You don't have to do that," he said. She didn't stop. "I know, but it's something I can do." He crouched beside her, pulling at a stubborn root. "My mother kept this garden, said it gave her something alive to tend when everything else felt hollow." Zadie leaned back on her heels. "I need it to grow." "For the children," he nodded, quiet again. Then, after a breath, "There's seed in the cellar. Beans, squash, even some cabbage if the mice haven't gotten to it." She smiled, not at him, but at the soil in her fingers. "That'll do." The sun crossed overhead slow and steady. They worked in rhythm, not speaking much, but the silence didn't press in, it just lay between them like a blanket pulled up to the chin. By dusk, the first neat rows had been carved, and Zadie sat near the porch with Daisy in her lap, brushing tangles from the child's hair. Dorian knelt by Asa, who showed him how to sharpen the blade of a drawknife against a whetstone, speaking in that same low, even voice he used with horses. Zadie watched them. Not with longing, not with fear. Just a quiet, blooming wonder that this a cabin with a stove that didn't burn out, a man who kept his words simple and true, a scrap of earth that might grow food again could be real. That night, after the children had gone to sleep, Asa stepped outside to wash his hands in the rain barrel. Zadie joined him, her shawl drawn around her shoulders, hands clasped in front of her. He glanced at her, then back toward the sky where the stars blinked faint behind thin clouds. "I'd meant to ask," she said. "Why do you stay alone out here?" He dried his hands on his trousers. "I don't think I've been alone, not really. Not since you came." She looked up at him, the breath catching sharp in her chest. He wasn't waiting for her to answer. He just stood there, arms loose at his sides, like her presence was enough. Zadie took a step forward. "I don't know what comes next," she whispered. Asa reached out and took her hand, slow, without pressure. "You don't have to, just stay the night. Then another." She nodded, unable to speak. He leaned in, his lips brushing her brow, not a kiss of possession but of promise. Zadie closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of wood smoke and soap. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like something broken someone had left behind. She felt like part of something just beginning. 3 days after the garden was turned, rain came slow and steady, soaking the soil and pooling in the grooves Zadie had dug with her own hands. She stood beneath the overhang of the porch, Daisy on her hip, watching the drops stitch the earth back together. Behind her, Dorian sat at the table, tongue between his teeth as he tried to carve the flat edge of a cedar block into something horse-shaped. Asa crouched beside him, offering quiet guidance, only correcting when Dorian asked. The boy had taken to the work with a quiet focus Zadie hadn't seen in him since before the leaving. Zadie stepped back inside, setting Daisy down with a handful of dried apples. "If you've got any spare cloth," she said, "I could take in the seams on your shirts. The ones near the door don't look like they've seen a needle in some time." Asa straightened. "They haven't. My stitching pulls crooked." She crossed to the chest near the hearth and opened it. "You've got good thread, though." "That's half the battle." He watched her for a moment, then turned back to Dorian. "You think your mother'd be willing to help me teach the mare to pull a sled come winter?" Dorian glanced up. "She's not real big. She's got heart. That counts." Zadie didn't look up. "If you've got harness leather, I'll stitch new traces. The ones she's wearing are cracked." Asa's pause was brief. "There's a roll in the shed. You'll need a strong needle." "I've got one." By evening, Daisy had fallen asleep in Zadie's lap, a shawl draped over her shoulders and curls damp from the heat. Asa tossed another log onto the fire, then leaned against the mantel, arms crossed, watching the shadows flicker up the wall. Zadie's needle moved steadily through the worn fabric of his shirt, thread catching in the firelight. "You ever think of adding on to this cabin?" He raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because your table only fits 3. She looked up. "And you've got 4 people eating here now." He didn't answer right away. Then, "If I built on, I'd need help raising the beams." "Then we'd do it together." His voice was low. "You're not planning to leave, are you?" She held his gaze. "I meant to." But meaning changes. Outside, the rain had stopped. The quiet pressed close, warm with the scent of pine smoke and damp wood. Asa moved across the room and sat on the bench opposite her. "There's a lot I don't ask. Mostly because I figure some things shouldn't be spoken unless someone's ready." Zadie's hands stilled in her lap. He went on, "But I want to understand what came before, not so I can fix it, just so I don't tread where I shouldn't." She looked down at her stitches. "I married young. Not because I loved him, not really, but because he made promises I needed to believe. He was kind at first, soft-spoken. Then, after the first winter, the kindness started to cost something." Asa didn't move. She continued, voice flat with memory. "He'd say he needed more time to get on his feet. Then it was more money. Then it was my silence. I gave him too much of all three." Asa's hands rested open on his knees, palms up. "When he left, I thought he'd take me apart piece by piece, but instead the worst of it was how whole I still felt. Like I'd been hollowed out and didn't even know it." He leaned forward. "You're not hollow now." "No," she said. "Not anymore." She reached out, laying her hand over his. His fingers curled around hers, steady, calloused, warm. The fire cracked behind them, and somewhere in the corner, the wind caught the edge of the window shutter and clicked it against the frame. Zadie spoke again, her voice quieter. "I don't need saving." "I know," Asa said. "I just want to stay near while you put things right." She smiled, then not the half-curve she'd offered before, but something full, unguarded. "Then you better learn how to stretch a beam straight. I won't stand for a crooked roof." "I'm better with wood than words," he said. "I've noticed." He leaned in, brushing his lips to hers. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a claim. Just an answer to something she hadn't dared ask. Zadie let her hand rest at the back of his neck, her forehead against his. When she pulled back, she whispered, "I never thought I'd want to belong anywhere again." "You don't have to belong," he said. "You can just be," but she shook her head. "I want to, here. With you." He didn't speak again that night, just pulled the blanket from the back of the chair and laid it gently over her shoulders before he banked the fire. And when she turned to watch him settle near the hearth, she knew without doubt or fear that whatever came next, she'd face it with him. Not because she had to, because she chose to. The first frost came in the night, thin and gleaming across the fields like breath held too long. Zadie woke before the light reached the horizon, her fingers stiff as she tucked the quilt closer around Daisy's small body. Dorian slept curled against the wall, one hand under his cheek. She moved quietly, not to wake them, and stepped out into the cold silence. Asa was already outside, crouched near the goat pen, rubbing warmth into the haunches of the smallest kid. A kettle steamed on a hook above the fire pit, and he turned when he heard her boots in the frost. "She's weak," he said, lifting the kid gently into his arms. "Didn't take milk last night." Zadie moved beside him, resting a hand on the animal's trembling side. "Could be her time, or she's just fighting the cold." "I'll keep her near the stove today," Asa said. "If she's got will, it'll show." Zadie looked toward the barn. "I'll check the feed sacks. If the oat's damp, it'll mold." "I stacked cordwood behind the shed," he said. "Dry and split. Enough to get us through if the next cold comes early." She met his eyes across the weak light. "You always plan ahead," he shrugged, adjusting the kid in his arms. "I've learned not to wait for the storm to prove it's coming." She followed him inside, the warmth of the stove spreading slow through the room. The goat kid settled in a crate by the hearth, and Asa crouched to wrap it in a wool scrap torn from an old coat. Zadie moved to the table, her hands already busy slicing the last of the dried apples into the cornmeal batter. The smell of cooking filled the cabin, and soon Dorian was up, tugging on his boots, asking if he could help split kindling. Asa handed him the hatchet without fuss, and Zadie watched as the boy followed him outside. Later, while Daisy napped and Dorian sat carving in the corner, Asa cleared space on the floor near the hearth and unrolled a large sheet of waxed linen, weighted at the corners with stones. He looked up at Zadie, who was stitching a torn hem, and nodded toward the cloth. "I've been marking where the low ground floods when the spring thaw hits," he said. "Want to plant more come next season, maybe corn. I could use your eye." She set the shirt aside and knelt beside him. "Where's your drainage?" he pointed, and she traced the line with her finger. "You'll lose half your seed if the ditch isn't dug deeper here." He studied her face. "You've run land before." "My father kept an orchard outside Abilene," she said. "Didn't matter that I was a girl. He taught me how to graft until same as my brothers. My mother only ever minded that I didn't track dirt through her kitchen." Asa smiled, the corners of his mouth pulling just slightly. "You miss it, some days." She tapped the map again. "But this feels more mine than that ever did." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her words settling between them. Then Asa said, "You ever think on what comes after spring?" She looked at him, her voice quiet. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if the garden holds and the goats birth clean and the kids grow stronger. If we make it through the thaw with more food than we started with." She tilted her head. "You asking if I'd stay on?" He shook his head. "I'm asking if you'd build with me." Zadie's breath caught, not in fear but in the unfamiliar grace of being asked, not claimed. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers with his. "Yes." He drew her hand to his chest, against the beat of a heart that had waited without demand. They didn't speak more of it that day, but something shifted quietly, like the settling of snow on a rooftop. That evening, Zadie found an old tin box tucked high in the rafters, filled with dried sage and 2 lengths of ribbon, one red and one dark blue. She brought it down, brushed off the dust, and laid it on the table. Asa watched her. "That was my mother's," he said. "She'd keep things there to give later, things that meant something." Zadie lifted the blue ribbon. "Then I'll use this when the time comes." "For Daisy's hair." He stepped closer, his fingers brushing the edge of the tin. "And the red," she met his gaze, "for me, for when we make our vows." He didn't touch her, didn't need to. The fire between them had already taken root deep and steady, no rush, no fear. Just the quiet certainty of 2 people choosing each other not out of need, but out of strength. Outside, the frost had begun to melt from the eaves. And inside, the cabin no longer felt like a place to pass through. It felt like home. The snow came late that year, drifting in soft and slow near the end of November. By then, the garden rows had long since browned and withered beneath their burlap coverings, the last squash packed away in the root cellar with the onions and dried beans. Inside the cabin, the air turned sharp in the mornings, and Asa set to rising early to light the stove before the rest stirred. Zadie had taken to sewing by lamplight once the children were asleep. Her fingers working steadily through a pile of old flour sacks she was turning into shirts for Dorian. The boy, growing taller by the week, had taken on the morning chores with the quiet determination Asa had once carried alone. Daisy, still small and full of questions, kept close to Zadie's skirts, humming tunes she made up with each step. One afternoon, when the sky hung heavy and low, Asa returned from the ridge with a brace of quail slung over his shoulder and a flush on his cheeks. Zadie was kneading bread at the table, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, hair pinned up tight against the heat. She looked up as he stepped inside, stomping snow from his boots, and her hands stilled. "Something happened?" she asked. He set the birds down on the counter. "Saw tracks near the western fence, wagon ruts." She wiped her hands on a cloth. "Could be someone passing through." "Could be," Asa said. "But I didn't hear them come past the road." She stepped closer. "You think someone's watching?" "I think someone paused long enough to leave questions behind." He looked toward the window where the snow had begun to fall again, but they didn't cross the fence line. Zadie's voice was firm. "Then let them wonder. We've got nothing to hide and no reason to run." Asa met her eyes. "I don't mean to stir worry, just want you to know what's out there." She touched his arm, her palm resting near the bend of his elbow. "I trust you to keep us safe, Asa, but I won't live afraid of shadows." "Not anymore." He nodded once, the tension in his jaw easing. "Then we'll keep our door open and our rifles clean." The rest of the day passed quiet. Dorian took to cleaning the quail feathers by the fire, and Daisy sang to herself while she sorted dried beans into small clay bowls. When the bread came out of the oven, the air filled with warmth, and the faint scent of rosemary from the sprig Zadie had dried weeks earlier. That night, after the children were asleep and the wind rattled against the windows, Asa pulled a wooden box from beneath the floorboards. He set it carefully on the table where Zadie sat, a half-finished shirt folded in her lap. "What's this?" she asked. "My father's ledger," he said. "I've kept it closed since he passed." Figured it was time to see what was worth keeping. She opened the lid and ran her fingers over the weathered pages. "You kept it all these years," Asa nodded. He wasn't always kind, but he wrote down everything, every trade, every promise made. "Thought maybe we'd use it to mark our own now." Zadie turned to the last page, blank and waiting. She picked up the pencil Asa handed her and wrote in clean, deliberate script, "First frost with full root cellar. Bread shared, children safe, warmth held." She passed it back. Asa added beneath her line, "Plans for spring planting. Fence will need mending come thaw." Zadie's hand in mine, she smiled without speaking, and he leaned forward, brushing her cheek with the back of his hand. The firelight caught in her eyes, and she rested her forehead against his. "Will you marry me?" he asked softly. She didn't move away. "I already have, with every morning I stayed." "But I'd still like to speak it aloud," he said. "In front of the children, maybe come Christmas." Zadie nodded. "Then we'll sew ribbons into Daisy's hair and carve a new button for Dorian's coat, and I'll wear that red ribbon, the one we found in your mother's box." Asa's voice was rough at the edges. "It'll be a good day." It was. Snow fell thick and clean the morning they stood on the porch, the sun just beginning to break through a low bank of clouds. Dorian held Daisy's mittened hand, both bundled in coats too large for their frames, watching as Asa and Zadie stood facing each other, boots sunk in the snow, breath visible between them. Asa had shaved, his hair combed neat, a blue kerchief tucked proper into his collar. Zadie wore a wool skirt patched with care, the red ribbon threaded through her braid and tied at the nape of her neck. No preacher stood for them, only the land and the sky and the two children they'd chosen to raise side by side. Asa took her hands in his. "I'll keep the fire lit," he said. "And the fence mended, and your heart safe." Zadie's voice was clear. "And I'll keep the table warm and the garden true, and your name spoken with care." They kissed, slow and certain, the kind that didn't need witnesses to be real. Dorian clapped once, and Daisy laughed, the sound bright against the cold air. That evening they laid the children down and sat by the fire, blankets pulled across their laps, the ledger open again on the table. Zadie added one more note in her hand, "The day we chose each other, with nothing owed and nothing taken. Only given." Asa closed the book and set it beside the stove. They slept that night in the same bed, beneath quilts Zadie had mended and Asa had carried home on his back from town. Their hands found each other in the dark, fingers laced without needing words. The snow held for weeks after. But the cabin stayed warm and the pantry stayed full and the hearts inside it knew peace. When spring came, the earth softened again and they planted together, side by side. And they never left.